All of the waiters at the hotel at the time, they all had broken English, except they were Germans, or they were Greeks, or they were Italians. There were no Latino waiters at the time. And my dad filed a union grievance to become a waiter. He wanted to become a banquet waiter. He always would make the joke anyway. That it didn't matter how good your English was, because when you're a banquet waiter, everybody gets the same thing. Everybody gets chicken.
There were definitely positive benefits from the U.S. relationship with Puerto Rico. It helped industrialize the island, built roads and infrastructure, and provided jobs that didn't exist. But it came at an enormous price. My anger in delving into this history is tempered by a conviction I've always had that the American people still cling to the basic sense of fairness. Once they have accurate facts, they rarely allow injustices to stand.
If you had to pick one date where U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America went wrong, the date would be 1954 in the place Guatemala. That was the beginning of this terrible, terrible attitude that the United States developed towards Latin America, and particularly towards Central America, where change became our enemy.
Guatemala fue tremendo. 200,000 muertos que hemos contabilizado, más de 50,000 desaparecidos, 83% de los desaparecidos y los ejecutados fueron mayas. O sea, el dolor es demasiado fuerte que nuestro pueblo nunca lo va a olvidar.
Guatemala was one of the few countries in Latin America that after World War II actually experienced a period of democratic rule. President Jacobo Arbenz was determined to reduce widespread poverty by effecting major land reform in Guatemala. Only 2% of the owners controlled 75% of the arable land, and of all those, the United Fruit Company was the largest, with some 600,000 acres of property. It was such a powerhouse, owning its own railroads, its own shipping lines. It really was more powerful than any government throughout most of the 20th century. In fact, Latin America became the incubator for all the great American multinational companies. Two of the key principals in the U.S. government, John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under President Eisenhower, his brother, Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, had both been law partners in the main law firm that represented United Fruit Company.
The feeling was we could very easily overthrow this progressive government and make it a lot easier for the United Fruit Company and other American businesses to operate in Central America.
The CIA got heavily involved in managing public opinion. It created the image of Arbenz as a crazy radical. And it was a systematic effort, mobilization and financing of opposition forces until the Arbenz government was overthrown. A vicious repression of all progressives and supporters of the Arbenz government ensued. Guatemala really began to establish a new pattern whereby the United States government used covert operations, employed local proxies to destabilize and overthrow governments in the region.
It's a great day for the liberation leader as the populace demonstrates its joy at being rescued from the tyranny that prevailed during the communist regime of ousted President Jacopo Arbenz Guzman. The end of the Civil War, and more important, the end of another attempt by the Kremlin to get a foothold in the New World.
After the overthrow, you have the beginnings of a civil war. People were picked up on the streets in the middle of the night, kidnapped, assassinated. You had the growth of a guerrilla war and of the government's efforts at counterinsurgency. As the rebels retreated into the countryside, they built up very big support among the Mayan and Canjobal people who had always been discriminated against by the Guatemalan government. The Civil War really went from about the 1960s to the 1980s. And as it escalated, the government responded with resettlement campaigns and a genocidal war against the Indians.
Yo salí de Guatemala después del que quemaron vivo a mi padre en la Embajada de España. Pedían asilo político al gobierno español. Y con el propósito de salvar sus vidas, entraron en la embajada. Y en ese momento las fuerzas de seguridad de Guatemala atacaron la embajada. Los quemaron vivos, a todos. Realmente ningún sobreviviente de los campesinos, de los estudiantes, de la gente que estaba allí. En Guatemala, si lo que hay es persecución, es asesinato, es matanza, lo que hay es inseguridad de la vida. Yo prefiero romper la frontera e ir donde sentiré más seguridad.
Los estadounidenses no tienen idea de por qué uno se viene a los Estados Unidos. No la tienen. Y si la tienen, yo creo que la tienen equivocada. Y fue bien difícil dejarla. Fue duro. Tenía 4 años, mija. Ni siquiera entendía que su mamá se iba a venir y no iba a estar mañana y cuando ella se levantara. Dejar tus hijos, eso no es fácil. Venir aquí, el precio que pagas es carísimo. No tiene precio. No tiene precio.
I was almost 7 years old when I came to LA to be reunited with my mother because she left Guatemala 3 or 4 years before I did. It was a very long trip. It was by bus, it was by car, by walking many, many miles. Going through the southern part of Mexico is one of the toughest parts. When it came to crossing the border, I had to say that the coyote was my father. and that my grandmother was my mother, and we were coming to visit. The immigration officer asked me, like, what's your mom's name? And I said, Aura. He asked me for my father's name, and I forgot. I forgot his name. Luckily, we were not sent back to Guatemala. We were not able to cross to the U.S. that first time because of my fault. But my grandmother is a person with a lot of persistence and a lot of tenacity, and she's like, no, we're gonna try again. In January 27, 1991, I came to LA. All I remember is seeing this really big pregnant woman running down the stairs, and I was worried that she was gonna fall off the stairs. And she lifted me up and she carried me and she was kissing me a lot. It was definitely very emotional. I think to some extent I did feel like a stranger. Like I think that I'm like, why is this woman hugging me so hard? And I was happy, but I was also, I think, to some extent confused of what's really going on. I think about that often, and I think that my children will be hopefully will be the first ones that there won't be a separation, you know, that I will be able to have my children and won't need to migrate, you know, to survive. Grandma did come undocumented, and then my mom came undocumented. I also came undocumented, and it took us over close to 20 years to be able to fix our status.
Cuando tú estás en Guatemala y tú piensas venirte para acá, tu plan no es quedarte, no. Pero cuando vienes aquí es otra historia. Y es más difícil cuando sos ilegal. Mucho más difícil.
Oh, I feel a breeze. You feel it?
Es amazing, es increíble para mí porque cuando yo vivía en Guatemala, yo no tenía ni idea de que existía Harvard. She's like, no, I'm moving in.
This is my diploma from Harvard University. Yeah, I can't believe it's my name in it.
Mariana Zamboni.
I think that my mom was given the opportunities to have achieved her educational dreams. She would have gone to Harvard. I believe she's a fighter.
Listen, I'm for pretty open immigration, but when the immigrants come, they come with a culture of criminality. It's out of control.
They put a strain on our Social Security, our education, our health care.
American history is replete with upsurges of anti-immigrant fervor. Immigration has always been a big battleground because there's always an attempt of those who came a while ago to then paint those who came more recently as the problem. The greatest danger we have is ignorance, because when people act out of ignorance, they usually act in ways that they come to regret later on.
Any summer since 1994, when this wall was put up, more people died those summers than the entire history of the Berlin Wall. Marco Antonio Villaseñor, the 5-year-old boy that dies with 18 men. Lucrecia Dominguez, the woman that dies in the arms of Jesus, her 15-year-old son. Anastasio Hernandez, stomped and tasered to death by the Border Patrol and Customs in 2010. People don't want to hear these stories, but these are stories that people need to hear. People do not want to leave their homeland. They don't want to leave their culture, their families, their language, what they're used to. Why would you want to pick up and leave like this?
Of course, you really can't tell the story of Latinos in America without dealing with the Mexican population, because Mexicans are by far the largest group of the Latino population in the United States. Most people are not aware that since 1820, when the United States first started gathering immigration statistics, there has been no nation in the world that has sent more people to the United States than Mexico. And we're talking about legal immigration. More legal Mexican immigrants have come to this country since 1820 than the Irish, than the Germans, than the French, than any other population. The reality is that great swaths of the United States in the West were originally part of Mexico. California, Nevada, parts of Utah, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. That was all the northern territory of Mexico, and there were Mexican citizens living on that land before it became part of the United States. As they say in South Texas or in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, we didn't cross the border crossed us.
Mexico was quite aware that the U.S. was coming and that they were willing to expand themselves everywhere possible, especially in those areas of North America that formerly belonged to Spain, then to Mexico, but were empty, almost empty. It was a very tempting piece of land there. Mexico City said, well, we cannot really defend the northern part of our new republic unless we have a demographic push there. But we don't have enough people in Mexico to fill that empty space. Why don't invite foreigners? Why don't invite Catholic foreigners? The Irish that were already coming to the US, let us receive them with open arms. But at the end, they were not Irish, they were not Catholic, and they brought the slaves.
Most of the settlers who moved into Texas came from the southern states. Many of them were slave owners themselves. So they naturally saw Texas as an area for expansion of slavery in America. But as more Americans moved into Texas, they suddenly began confronting the reality that the Mexican government had abolished slavery. The admission of Texas and then the Mexican-American War that followed is really a war to expand slavery in America. It was a short but vicious war. Once General Scott captures Mexico City and other U.S. troops occupy California, New Mexico, and the other northern territories of Mexico, the big question arises, how much of this territory is the United States going to keep?
Why did they decided to go back? The possibilities of contamination, physical as well as cultural contamination, could be a real danger for the U.S. So let us move out of Mexico. Let us move out of the territory in which we can find Mexicans. We don't want a Mexico with Mexicans.
Eventually, Congress decides to absorb as much territory as possible with the fewest people, but that leaves few hands to mine the resources. From the very beginning, the West depended for its labor on Mexicans. So that our wealth and prosperity here is not only due to the labor of the original settlers, but is also due to those Americans who were conquered. Then comes the Depression, unemployment skyrockets, a furor arises over competition by Mexican labor for jobs, and the Hoover administration initiates a massive deportation program. As many as 1 million Mexicans were just loaded onto trains and shipped out of the country. Some estimates are that as many as 60% of those deported were actually American citizens. There's been a pattern now for the last 100 years of Mexicans being recruited into the country and then shipped back out of the country. Recruited into the country, shipped back out of the country. The reality is that it's two countries, but one economy. The Mexicans function as a reserve labor force in good times in America and as an expendable labor force in the bad times.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
During World War II, you couldn't get any more immigrants from Europe, and the United States economy to fight the war was growing. The government was forced with two choices: bring African Americans up from the South and bring Mexicans and Puerto Ricans up from Latin America.
In Spanish, braceros means a man who works with arms and hands. But in American lingo, they are called lifesavers.
During World War II, the bracero program is initiated as a means of guaranteeing the steady flow of labor.
The important thing at those days was, how many hands do you have? ¿Cuántas manos tiene? The more hands you had, the more cotton you could pick. So education for Latinos was not that important. At age 10, I began my first formal schooling. A school that was called Schumannsville Mexican School. We had one room, one teacher, 8 grades. I felt that the majority of society wanted to keep you down, that you were a migrant. You should be in your place. Two days after my 17th birthday, I was sent to the South Pacific. The Marine Corps changed my life. It taught me a great deal about hard work. It taught me a great deal about values. I've always felt that proud feeling of being a Marine. After coming back, we felt that we fought for the United States. So we aren't just as good as any person. I took a GED and I passed it, and I went on to college when I was recalled back to Korea. Landed in Busan, Korea on my 24th birthday. We were not only fighting the enemy, but we were fighting the bitter cold. One of my men in my platoon got wounded, got shot in the head, delirious. I carried him up the hill. I got trapped on my knee and my hand. I kept on going. I came back from Korea and I got a job teaching one of the poor school districts in Texas. And I had 44 students, all Latinos. I still run into so many students, and some would say to me, if it had not been for you, I would have never finished high school. I always wear in my lapel an American flag because I am so proud to have served this country. And my parents were very proud that I served this country. We had 4 brothers that went to service during World War II. They say, to whom much is given, much is expected.
Several 100,000 Mexicans and Puerto Ricans served in World War II. And interestingly, much of the civil rights ferment in the Latino community came after the war from those veterans.
Dr. King convened us. We can talk about what the farm workers meant and how they fed the country. Because we who in the South grew up picking cotton and chopping tobacco didn't know those who were picking tomatoes and picking lettuce and picking grapes. We didn't know we were being picked on in different fields and different languages. When we were fighting for voting rights, that we sit in the same office together. We were fighting for equal protection, that we sit. We fight for affirmative action, that we sit. We fight for our share board seats, that we sit. So on all issues around equal opportunity and equal protection under the law and civil rights and social justice, that we end up together.
Well, wait for the history. The history will say what we are.
I came from Cuba when I was 10 years old on a freedom flight in October of 1969. Inside my heart, I was broken. I had been separated from everything I loved. The place that I loved and the people that I loved. The Cubans are, for the most part, political refugees. And even when you cite all of these economic reasons why they're here, behind it, when you really dig deep, is a political reason. The US and Cuba have had this history. And all of the immigration has to do with that history and the role that the United States has played in Cuban affairs.
Navy warships are a common sight in Havana Harbor. The treaty ending the Spanish-American War has given the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to protect American investment on the island. A favorite port of call, our young sailors call friendly Havana a good liberty town.
The United States would occupy particular countries, basically rewrite the laws, train a new military, and then groom local dictators who, in essence, carry out American policy and turn over their countries for exploitation. Cuba was independent, but it was independent under the tutelage and control of the United States. Fulgencio Batista was the most powerful figure throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and through most of that period functioned as a virtual dictator, always supporting and facilitating additional penetration of the Cuban market by American companies. There's no doubt that the level of repression of the Batista regime sparked widespread discontent among the population and united all of the people to overthrow his rule.
Yo creo que los días más felices de mi vida fueron precisamente los de la caída de Batista. La idea de que llegaba la libertad a Cuba y que todos íbamos a participar en la construcción de un país. Pero a las pocas semanas a mí me repugnaba el espectáculo de los fusilamientos y de los juicios. Aquellos juicios que eran unos verdaderos circos.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
Los estudiantes y los campesinos empezaron un proceso de rebelión contra la nueva dictadura. Había una persona infiltrada en el grupo que le comunicó a la policía política lo que estábamos haciendo. Nos condenaron a 20 años de cárcel y como yo era menor de edad, pues me trasladaron a una cárcel de menor rigor hasta que cumpliera los 18 años. Y de esa cárcel me pude escapar. Lo recuerdo como si fuera hoy, y esto hace 50 años. Yo estaba seguro de que regresaríamos antes de 2 años. Y la emoción más fuerte que yo sentía era el compromiso con los estudiantes presos, con mis compañeros que habían quedado en la cárcel.
In 1961, Castro's army defeated an invasion of 1,400 Cuban exiles trained and equipped by the CIA. The Bay of Pigs became an embarrassment for the United States and served to increase Castro's popularity on the island and around the world.
Fue un terrible error del gobierno de los Estados Unidos lanzar una invasión a la que no estaban dispuestos a respaldar.
The vanguard of an estimated 50,000 refugees from Castro's Cuba arrives in Florida.
The first Cuban refugees were largely from the upper and middle classes. Castro instituted major health and education reforms for the poor, but some 215,000 exiles had left the island by 1962.
The end result was what the strategy has always been, to get rid of the enemy. And so a new wave of refugees comes, which leaves Cuba without the opposition. The sadness of this exile that wasn't temporary, like my father believed, became sort of an exciting new life at some point. I put all of my heart into learning English, into fully, being part of this new place. I was in love with this new life and with this country, and I felt like I was an Americanita. '80, I think, is the year that defined Miami. It basically convulsed the city when 10,000 Cubans stormed the Peruvian embassy seeking exile, and then ended up being part of the flotilla that brought 125,000 Cubans to Miami in 5 months. Talk about social upheaval. That was it. You could see, for example, the line of boats going down to Key West, because Fidel Castro had said, you can leave if you want to, and Jimmy Carter had said, we welcome you with open arms. And then, as the Marielitos were mistreated, and as all of this anger over bilingualism was taking place, I was really coming to terms with the fact that no matter how hard I tried, I wouldn't be, like, Tom Wolfe would say, an American in full. And I do believe that my experience was replicated by many Cubans, and I think that is why we built a different Miami.
Before the Cubans arrived, Miami was a sleepy resort town. The enormous renaissance of Miami and the growth of its trade and its commerce is really due in large part to the sacrifice and work of the Cuban population and then other Latinos who came after as the Cubans paved the way to develop Miami into the largely Latino city it is today.
We want the folks across the United States to know that we're standing with them to protect American lives, liberty, and property from the invasion of the illegal aliens.
But Arizona is taking measures into its own hands. The state Senate has passed a tough new immigration law that will force police to arrest people who can't prove they're in the country legally. Now, critics say that would lead to racial profiling. Well, so what?
The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
I'm here because the United States invaded my country in 1965. An illegal invasion, completely trumped up excuse to invade the Dominican Republic and crush our democratic hopes. We've lived the consequences of that illegal invasion politically, economically, and in the bodies of the people who were wounded, the bodies of the people who were killed. We've been living it for over 40 years.
There have been two major U.S. occupations of the Dominican Republic. The first was in 1916. The U.S. Army trained a new Dominican National Guard. It handpicked a former railway security officer, Rafael Trujillo, to lead that guard. And Trujillo then uses the power of the military to seize control of the government.
He was like the most horrific imagination of this terrifying dictator. He would disappear Dominican and American citizens and kill them with impunity.
He basically ruled the Dominican Republic for 30 years with absolute, total control. He routinely kidnapped and assaulted the wives, even of his supporters. And throughout his career, made it extremely easy for American companies to do business in the Dominican Republic, but was a savage, savage dictator. Eventually, even the United States government could not stomach his methods of operation, so the CIA joined with disgruntled military officers to back his assassination.
For the first time in 30 years, the people of the Dominican Republic are breathing the sweet air of liberty, and the streets are jammed in celebration.
Mataron al chivo en la carretera, mataron al chivo en la carretera,
In 1963, you have the election of Juan Bosch. He was a liberal, a social democrat who attempted to institute new social reforms. But the Bosch government didn't last for very long. Only a few months into his term in office, there was a military coup. That military coup in turn spurred a popular insurrection that led to the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965. When the rebels finally agreed to lay down their arms, the United States government scheduled new elections. But it also allowed the right-hand man of Trujillo, Joaquin Balaguer, to run in those elections for president. Balaguer won that election. The problem was that there was enormous repression against the Bosch forces, killings on an almost daily basis. So the United States then began allowing large numbers of Dominican former rebels to come to the United States as a way, again, of using migration as a safety valve. Thousands of Dominicans started coming to New York City.
Well, they said we're coming to the United States, whatever that meant. I thought we were just going up the road to some mystical place. When I finally saw a map in kindergarten of how far we had traveled, I remember being not only astonished, but literally terrified. My father was a standard kind of crazy Latino military guy who would check his children's hands and their shoes and their clothes and their hair before we left the house. I mean, we had to tie our shoes a certain way. I lived in what I call the little dictatorship, the little dictatorship of our house. When I immigrated to New Jersey, it was a very crazy time. I immigrated in 1974, a few months before the fall of Saigon. This was not a place that was very welcoming. I found myself facing a tremendous amount of racism and bigotry, but not just from like white Americans, from black Americans, and from Latinos. I think if every immigrant child in this country was allowed to tell the real emotional truth of their experience here, people in the United States would discover that we actually make immigration a more horrific experience than it needs to be. And I feel that as a country, we're in a dream where there are no mistakes, there is no evil, we are always good, we hurt no one. You know, you can't grow if you admit no mistakes.
All those hundreds and thousands that sneak into our country that could be diseased.
Illegal immigrants are attacking our culture and our way of life. They are
The most extreme elements in this country want open borders.
The process of migration transforms people so that they end up being not only strangers in the land they've come to, they also become estranged to some degree from the land they left. Migration creates this limbo itself of a new identity that is ni aquí ni allá, neither here nor there.
All the people of this hemisphere are entitled to a decent way of life, and to transform that principle into the reality of economic advance and social justice on which political equality must be based. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable.
Power sometimes is very disagreeable when you have to make very painful decisions. You see, to run a country like ours, it has to hurt you a great deal because you have to make decisions which sometimes are not agreeable.
Nicaragua, like many of the Caribbean basin countries, suffered from the same family rule. First with Anastasio Somoza, and then with his two sons succeeding him. They were perhaps as brutal, if not quite at the same level as the Trujillo, but they also wanted to run the country to meet their own needs and the needs of those immediately around them.
Even Roosevelt said of Somoza, you know, he might be an SOB, but he's our SOB. I think when I went to Latin America, I was very naive. I was going down to do, you know, really good work, to talk about God. And the more I was there, the more I all of a sudden found myself going in the same circle that people are, the same, you know, you go from poverty to poverty, to more poverty. And, you know, all of a sudden you say, now, wait a second, there's something the matter with this whole system.
To understand where Nicaragua is heading, you have to know where it has come from. The young rebels who took to the streets in insurrection were battling a family that had ruled Nicaragua for almost 50 years, the Somozas, a family installed in power by the U.S. government following 20 years of occupation of Nicaragua by the U.S. Marines. Though their countrymen were desperately poor, the Somoza family amassed a huge personal fortune.
General, I've been told that your wealth is in the neighborhood of $500 million.
Well, that's what the people who adverse me say that. But I think we're around $100 million.
You own the national airline?
Yes.
You own the national shipping line?
Yes, I founded that.
Including your own port, Port Somoza?
Also, we founded that.
You own the Mercedes-Benz dealership for the country?
Yes, I got that when I was a major in the Army.
You own the leading television station?
Yes.
Radio station. You own huge financial interests in banks and insurance companies? And you
yes, we could go on and on.
And then the Somozas made the fatal mistake of killing the national hero, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, this crusading journalist. After they killed Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, the banks and businesses closed their doors and went on strike. And so the economy of Nicaragua fell to a trickle.
Such was the widespread revulsion toward the Somoza family that when their regime was finally toppled in July of 1979, the victorious revolutionaries were a broad-based coalition of Nicaraguan society, the church, big business, students, city dwellers, farmers.
Peoples more numerous and more politically aware are craving and now demanding their place in the sun, not just for the benefit of their own physical condition, but for basic human rights.
Jimmy Carter, unlike many of the previous presidents and those who would come after, was more willing to accept sort of a diversity of political views around the world, including to accept the Sandinistas as the legitimate government of Nicaragua.
The wonderful thing was those first few years after the revolution, everybody was working together. It was a real time of hope, and it was a moment that nobody can take from those people. But unfortunately, their children didn't live it.
Many of those who fought alongside the Sandinistas saw their revolution betrayed. They were denied power in the new government. Some were imprisoned, others exiled. Thousands who fought with the Sandinistas have taken up arms against them and are now called the Contras. They are freedom fighters.
The Contras were mostly former National Guardsmen. They would come in and just arrest anybody who was young, take them, torture them. If they were lucky, they were let go. Mothers would say to their kids, get out of the country. I don't want you getting caught up in this. You know, that's just what the ambience was in the country at that time. And then when you had the Contra attacking, and then the government wanting to recruit the sons to go and fight the Contra, then it was really get these kids out of here.
Good evening. When President Reagan and Attorney General Edwin Meese appeared in the White House briefing room on short notice today, no one was prepared for their surprising announcements that money from the controversial Iran arms deal was secretly funneled to the Contra rebels, fighting the Sandinista government of Nicaragua.
The Iran-Contra scandal was huge and should have been much bigger. What the United States decided to do was to open up ties to Tehran by selling them surface-to-air missiles. The profits of those sales were then put into banks in Switzerland and were removed to pass to the Contras, who were trying to overthrow the Sandinistas. What Iran-Contra represented at the very heart of the problem was to ignore American law. American law clearly stated that the United States was not allowed to provide military assistance to the Contras. And American law also stated that we weren't going to do business with governments such as Iran that were involved with terrorist actions. The instability that we have contributed to creates the kind of chaos and disarray that leads to more immigration. Because you can argue that if we move into these societies and contribute to this dysfunction, we have a moral obligation to help the people who feel unsafe in the situations that we, in part, have created.
There's a Luis Enrique Mejia Lopez from 1 year old to 15. There's another Luis Enrique Mejia Lopez from 15 on. Everything changed. Everything in what a 15-year-old supposedly should not be exposed to. But in my case, it gave me the tools to be who I am now. I lived in a city called Iriamba, and right next to the house that I lived in, there was the police station. A couple of nights, my brother and I heard people screaming so loud that you could hear it in our rooms. For me, that was a very traumatic experience.
No es lo que veía desde la ventana de mi cuarto. El verano del 78 vi una nube que crecía y mi infancia que se iba.
On one side, I had some of my family that were with the government and some of my family that was not with the government. So I was caught up in the middle of this thing, trying to figure out things for myself. You can't make a kid when he's 15 years old choose a side, especially of something that he doesn't truly know what it is about. I lost a lot of my friends. And then you ask yourself, what are we dying for? What saved my brother and I is that my grandfather on my mom's side of the family decided to send us to the States.
Luego dijeron, no, esta cabrona como no quieres hablar y todo, pásenme la estaca. Solo me dieron vuelta el cuerpo y me metieron una estaca en el recto. Me ataron las manos hacia atrás y me pusieron una venda muy fuerte. Yo oía gritos hasta de jóvenes y de gente quizá adulta, hombres y mujeres que lloraban y que daban gritos horribles. Me dijeron, no te vamos a hacer nada. Lo que queremos es que nos des los nombres y direcciones de tus compañeros con quien trabajas. Yo siempre les dije, no conozco a nadie, no tengo ni nombres ni direcciones. Y dijeron, bueno, esta cabrona no quiere hablar. Oí yo que decían, ¿a quién le toca la primera tortura? Y alguien decía, a mí. Yo de momento pensé que era así como algo psicológico, pero no, luego me quitaron la ropa, me violó uno de ellos, me pusieron choques eléctricos en los senos y en todo mi
Professor,
cuerpo.
not to interrupt, but I can't see the...
Luego dijeron, no, esta cabrona como no quieres hablar y todo, pásenme la estaca. Solo me dieron vuelta el cuerpo y me metieron una estaca en el recto. Yo sentí que me morí de repente. Luego sentí que oí que dijeron, esta cabrona ya se murió. En las afueritas de San Miguel, ahí me tiraron a un lado de la carretera. Yo no sé a qué horas pude reaccionar. Sí existen los milagros, porque hubieron miles y miles de torturados que no tuvieron la suerte que yo tuve de sobrevivir.
We can talk for hours about Bishop Romero. He was special. He, like most of us, went through this conversion. He was silent, aloof, but something happened to Bishop Romero. He began to hear the cry of his people. He felt their suffering. And what he said was that, I'm a bishop, a Catholic bishop with a lot of influence and power. I must speak for my people who don't have a voice.
Every Sunday, the whole country listened to him. You could walk down the block and not miss a word he said because everybody was listening. And he would say, Guardia, basta ya. It's enough already. Stop it. Stop the killing.
The last sermon of Archbishop Oscar Romero that he gave in the cathedral the day before he was assassinated, where he made a special plea to the men in the military, saying to them, stop the killing. Lay down your weapons. Disobey your superior officers telling you to kill your fellow campesinos. And obey a higher law. That law that says thou shalt not kill.
Cuyos lamentos suben hasta el cielo cada día.
His assassination in church stunned the entire nation.
As the crowd started to grow, they realized that this was going to be a very difficult time. And we could see all the Guardia that were on all the roofs. All of a sudden, there was a shot fired. And then the bomb went off. Everybody just scattered. Then the Guardia opened fire.
Stop the repression! Look at this guy. Look at this fella. What's your position?
Stop the repression in El Salvador! Our tax dollars are killing priests!
Let me just say a word about El Salvador. Maybe it'll help.
Why are we killing priests in El Salvador?
The answer is we're not. Now you be quiet, and here's the answer to your question.
You will understand if you read from our reporting that it was the Salvadoran military who killed these women. Have no doubt about that.
We learned that the vast majority of those who participated in these massacres and human rights abuses were trained right down the street here at the School of Americas. The United Nations Truth Commission report on El Salvador documented
Professor,
that
it's
those
past
who
8:15,
killed Bishop Oscar Romero
and there are
trained
some
here
people
at
that
this
need to
school.
go, including myself.
Those who raped and killed the...
Hello? Hello?
Yes, Professor?
Yes.
Yes, I was just informing you that it was past 8:15, and there are some students that have to go, including myself.
All right. It's almost the end. That's the last. That's last was from El Salvador. It was almost the same thing. Okay. What we are going to do is that we are going to discuss this film when we come back on Monday. Okay.
Okay.
We're gonna take 15 minutes to go over the film. Okay.
Okay. All right.
I'm not going to take the attendance today because some people who knows about this told me that I can at the blackboard at the end when I close the class can tell me how many who entered and who was absent from the let's see the if that doesn't work, I'm going to go back to my peculiar way of taking the attendance. Okay, any question?
Yes, Professor. When would the extra credit for the response to this film be due?
From the you mean the questionnaire?
No, in the beginning of class, I could be wrong, but I thought you mentioned that if we wrote a response paper, that we would receive extra credit.
No, if you write, I was talking about the film, right?
Yes.
Yes. If you write a page and a half summary of what the film was about, I will give you extra credit.
When would that be due? When should we turn that paper in?
Let's say by 5 days from now.
So on the 8th of February?
Yes, you can. I'm going to give you the how you're going to submit that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Anybody have a question?
Professor?
Yes.
I have a question, but it's about the film. It's not about the class.
Okay.
I mean, can I ask it?
Wait. I can hear you.
I have a question, but it's about the film.
Yes.
It's not necessarily. It's not like. Okay. Can I ask it?
Yeah, I got that. I got that part. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. It strikes me that there are a lot of people, very, very unsavory people in Puerto Rico, and not all of them were American. I mean, it strikes me that Guatemala was our fault, but was it that the CIA kept on backing coups, like to specifically support these people, and if so, why was it in our interest?
Okay, let me say this. Let's take some time, bring those questions and we discuss the question because we have to discuss those questions anyway. Okay, when on Monday when we come back, bring up the question and we, as part of the discussion, the group discussion. Okay. Are you?
Thank you.
Okay. But it's important and interesting. Anybody else? Okay, have a good night, and we'll see each other Monday.